we're not encouraging kids to engage in this behavior. We'd much prefer that they don't. The kind of arguments I've had with people, they say, well, how would you feel if your child sexted? And I'd say, I'd be mortified, I'd be disappointed. But if they did and they followed each of the strategies I offer in this article, it would minimize my concern because it's less likely that the really worst of the bad implications will happen.
This is the Parenting in Perspective podcast. It's a Happy Families podcast. And my name is Dr. Justin Coulson. Thank you so very much for being a part of these in-depth discussions. Today, we're putting the subject of adolescent online behaviour under the microscope with Dr. Justin Patchin. Justin is a professor of criminal justice at the University of Wisconsin. And in the worlds of teens and technology, he is a bona fide global expert. Justin's been researching and studying how teens interact online and with devices for almost 20 years, with a focus on cyberbullying, social networking, and sexting. Justin co-founded the Cyberbullying Research Center and has written a number of books about the online world and adolescent behavior. And his work has sent him all the way to the White House and the FBI Academy to discuss the fallout of teens and the misuse of technology. So Justin and I met at a conference, the National Center Against Bullying Conference in Melbourne a few years ago, and we got to know one another, and he just knows his stuff. I'm so excited to talk to him. I began, as always, by asking Dr. Justin Patchin about his neck of the woods and, of course, his family.
Well, I appreciate being on the podcast, and I'm in Wisconsin. I'm in Altoona, Wisconsin, which is on the western side of the state. And if you're not familiar with Wisconsin, it's kind of in the middle of the northern U.S. About halfway between Chicago and Minneapolis, if you know those bigger cities. I actually grew up in far northern Minnesota, which is closer to the Canadian border than I am now.
But where you are, it's cold, right? Like it snows.
It does snow, although today it was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's pretty warm. I mean, obviously it's our summertime now, so but we get lots of snow in the winter, and but I love it here. And I've been in Wisconsin for 16 years. I did my graduate school work in Michigan, and like I said, I grew up in Minnesota. So I have a wife, and a little less than 2 weeks ago, we celebrated our 20th anniversary. So we've been married for 20 years and have a son who is 10 years old. And it's a great time, great age to be a parent.
Well, I'm excited to learn more about your family and especially what you do with your work and how that intersects with what you talk to your children, your son about. But let's talk about the work that you do. You run an international website about cyberbullying. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that website, but I'm also really curious. So most of the people that I talk to on this podcast have a psychology background. I mean, that's my real area of interest, my passion. It's my background. You've got this criminal justice background, but here you are talking about children and what's going on online. So tell us about the cyberbullying website. And I love this resource. I've relied on it many times and shared it often on my Facebook page. But I'd love to know more about the website and also why you decided to make this your life's work.
I've always been interested in working with youth. So even when I was in high school, I coached like T-ball and I coached younger kids' activities. And I actually worked in the juvenile justice system with youth when I was in college. And I really loved it. I enjoyed it a lot. And I was intersecting with other kind of professionals in that space, probation officers, social workers, psychologists. And they said, if you really want to make a difference in this field, you should go to graduate school and then you can get these other jobs. And so I intended to get a master's degree and then become like a juvenile probation officer or caseworker, something like that. But I went to graduate school at Michigan State University, and I loved it so much that I hung around until they gave me a PhD. But even my doctorate in criminal justice was a very interdisciplinary degree. So I took a lot of psychology classes, a lot of family and child ecology classes. For my program, you have to set up kind of a cognate an area, and mine was kind of juvenile delinquency prevention or youth violence prevention. But the story of the website, cyberbullying.org, starts at Michigan State University, because my very first day in graduate school on campus, I met a guy named Samir Hinduja. And I went to Michigan State to study, youth violence and school violence, bullying, those kinds of things. Samir went from Florida to Michigan to study computer crime and high-tech crime and identity theft. And he grew up building computers and taking them apart. And his dad had a computer business. And so we shared an office, a very tiny office on campus at Michigan State. And we were doing the work of our professors, right? That's what you do in graduate school. You know that. And so we were doing the work of professors, but talking about our own interests, mine in kids and his in kind of technology. And round about maybe 2000, maybe 2001, we started thinking about the ways that kids were using technology or misusing technology. And this term cyberbullying that we had heard came up, and we didn't know much about it.
And so this is the early 2000s. There is no Facebook. There is no 3G. There's no smartphones. I'm just trying to get a recalibration of what the digital environment was in 2001. I mean, people were accessing the internet. Google was just becoming a thing. But what was actually happening on the internet then? And obviously, how did this conversation and this relationship evolve into cyberbullying.org and your ongoing partnership? I mean, you guys still work together every day.
Exactly. Yeah, when we had first heard the term cyberbullying, what we were hearing of examples of kids sending mean emails, or more often it was in chat rooms. So back in the late 90s, early 2000s, chat rooms were a big deal. And most people are familiar with chat rooms because of kind of the concerns about predators and grooming and those kinds of things. And so chat rooms specifically have kind of gone out of favor probably since 2002 or 2003. We just started by having chats with kids and some youth that we knew, and asked them if they were running into problems online. Then we talked to some teachers and asked them if they were seeing problems in their schools, and asked some parents, what are you seeing? And they would mention this stuff. And so we were starting to see that there was an issue. So we did our first kind of pilot survey of students, and I think it was in 2002, might have been in late 2001. But it took us like a year and a half just to do the research, because Michigan State University didn't want to approve us to do the research, because we were probably one of the first on campus to do online research. And so they didn't have protocols through our institutional review board for consent and all those things. So it took over a year to get the permission to do this. And so it was a very simple study. It was a convenient sample. I think we linked a survey to a couple of websites that were popular among kids at the time. And we just wanted to see what was going on out there. And one question in that survey really caught our attention. So since we didn't know much about cyberbullying, we had one open-ended question in the survey. Tell us in as much detail as you feel comfortable about your most recent experience with cyberbullying. And we figured because we're dealing with adolescents, they would give us like a one-sentence response. It sucked, or it was terrible, or they were mean. But they told us, they gave us like paragraphs. I mean, they wrote so much in this survey, many of them, that it messed up our survey. Like we had to establish certain boundaries for how many characters to allow in a survey, and we didn't allow enough. And so when we got the data dump, everything was messed up, and it took us like 3-4 months just to fix the data. But we learned right then and there that there was a story that these kids wanted to tell. They didn't feel comfortable telling their parents about it because they didn't know anything, especially back then, about technology. So they were just kind of holding on to this. And so we've been studying it ever since. And we've done, probably 15 formal surveys of adolescents. We've surveyed parents, we've surveyed police officers, and we've been going from there.
How does this happen? You meet some random person and end up sharing an office, and next thing you know, you've created your life's work together. It's interesting as we consider what life used to be like. When you started to describe it, I was like, oh, it almost sounds so nice. We were dealing with some chat room issues compared to the stuff. Now, I don't want to downplay it because it was serious, and obviously the messages that you were getting from people through your data highlighted the seriousness of it.
Right.
But as you said, the technology shift in the last 20 years has been extraordinary. When you look at what the data is telling us today, what's your sense of what's going on online? What do parents need to know now?
They need to know a lot about a lot of different things, but I think sometimes parents worry too much about things that aren't as big of a concern. So particularly in the early days of our work, 2000 to 2007 or 8, will say parents were primarily concerned with kind of the grooming and the stranger danger, and my kid's going to meet, some predator in a chat room and they're going to get, kidnapped. And while that does happen, it's extremely rare. We obviously need to be aware of it. We need to have conversations with our kids about who they're interacting with online. But if we're focusing so much on this one problem, we'll forget that it's much more likely that our child is going to be victimized by somebody they know, right? So if you're preaching to them, don't talk to strangers online, well, then they might be talking with somebody they have a relationship with, a family member, some other person, and then let their guard down. They need to have general skills about keeping themselves safe online, no matter who they're communicating with.
And this kind of gets to what I guess we'd call it the psychological heuristics, like the availability heuristic. Okay, so there are so many clicks when there's one of those awful stories, and they do exist. I mean, we need to acknowledge that this is an extraordinarily serious crime, and it does happen. And some people their lives are changed forever because of these kinds of experiences. But the media will obviously make a big deal about it, and therefore there's a sense in the minds of parents that this kind of thing is happening all the time. And what I'm hearing you say is, yet happens, yet serious, and yes, we need to talk to our children about it. It's important that we are across it, but this is unlikely to be the reality for most of our children. They're going to be dealing with other kinds of things other than potentially being groomed. They might be, and we need to protect, but once we've had one or two conversations, we're probably okay to focus on other things.
That's right. And so the analogy I sometimes use is talking to your children about going outside in a thunderstorm, right? They could get struck by lightning. That's a really bad thing that could happen. It does happen, but more likely they're going to get soaking wet. They might get sick. There's a lot of other potentially bad things that could happen as well. And we need to have conversations with them about all of those things, but you don't necessarily have to dwell on the lightning, because once you say, look, if it's lightning outside, you probably want to get inside. You probably want to stay away from that tree.
Don't swim in the pool when there's lightning.
Don't swim in the pool, right? And it's a serious enough issue, lightning or predators, that you probably only need to have one or two conversations with them because they get it. They figure that out pretty quick, kids do. But when you're talking about relationships that they're going to have with their peers and some of the potential problems that might arise in those situations, particularly when you have the peer pressure, and as you pointed out, those issues aren't covered as heavily in the media. I think those are the ones that we need to spend more time having conversations with our kids about.
So what are you seeing in the data in terms of these interpersonal, the psychological term is relational aggression. Okay, we've got kids that are being unkind to kids online. I mentioned Ask FM from 2008 or whenever it was when that was going bananas. Now it just happens on Snapchat and it happens on TikTok, and we see people engaging in harmful trends. They make the news all the time as well. Do we need to be mindful of that? How do we deal with the bullying thing? How prevalent is it? What about sexting? Give us a snapshot of where the world is and how our children are being affected.
Well, a lot of people like to ask me, what the worst app is, or what the worst site is, or where bullying is happening most often. And I often, when I answer that question, sometimes I throw them a curveball and I say, well, bullying's happening most often at school. Because in all the research we've done, bullying still affects more kids at school than online. And so I wrote a blog post, kind of controversial post a few years ago saying, ban school, open Facebook, because the data is clear that there's more kids affected at school than online. But that's a function of kind of where they are. And so when parents or anybody wants to know the app that has the most bullying, just look at the app where more kids are hanging out. So now it's Snapchat, it's TikTok. So you're going to see problems in these environments. There's nothing inherently bad about most social media sites. There are some really bad ones, right? But most kids aren't using those. And some are maybe experimenting with them. But the more popular the app is, the more likely that we're going to see problems on there, whether it's cyberbullying or used in any number of ways to get into trouble.
Where the people are is where the problems are likely to occur.
That's exactly right. And the other thing that we see consistently in our research is it's very rare for a child to only be bullied online. If they're being bullied online, something like 85% of the time, they're being bullied at school as well. And it's hard to know if it's the same kids who are doing it, about the same issues, or what the causes are. But this is another reason why we it's less of an issue now than it was 15 years ago, but schools were reluctant to get involved in cyberbullying incidents, saying that if it happened online, it's not our responsibility. There's nothing we can do. I think that mentality is changing slowly, for one reason, because we've been able to make the case that, look, if it's happening online, it's probably happening at the school as well. And once the school digs into it, they tend to see that it is happening there also.
So when I look at the data around the online challenges that parents are most likely to experience, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I see the biggest three issues as cyberbullying, explicit content, children being exposed to online content that is, well, you could argue that it's not for anybody, but it's certainly not for children. And the third thing that I see as being challenging for parents is just the compulsion that kids have to be online. I can't get them off their phone. They're in their room and they just won't leave it alone. So I wonder if we can just talk about each of these, and you can tell me what your data is showing in terms of how much it's happening, but also what parents might do to help their children to make good decisions around this. You wrote a very provocative piece at the start of 2020 about sexting. So let's start there. Sexting is what the adults call sending nudes. But essentially the definition is taking photos or a video of your private parts and sending them to somebody else.
Yeah, so we've been studying sexting now for a while.
How much does it happen? Because everyone's paranoid that everyone's doing it.
Everyone is not doing it. And I get frustrated because I do see headlines here in the US that say that exact thing. Everyone's doing it. The majority of kids are doing it. It's simply not true. And there's no research that has shown a majority of teens have participated in sexting, both either sending or receiving.
There was an Australian government study done just a few years ago. I can't remember the government department that did it, but I looked carefully at the data and they were finding that around 50% of Australian teenagers were doing it. It's the only data that I've ever found with numbers that high. Usually it's less than 20%.
Yeah, ours are less than 20%. We did a national study in the US in 2016. We replicated it again in 2019. And, roughly 13 to 15% have sent an explicit image, and this is 12 to 17-year-olds. So this is sort of middle school and high school for us.
And just before you go on to the other data, of that 12 to 15% of 12 to 17-year-olds, I presume that there's a linear relationship between age and likelihood of sending. So the older you get, the more likely it is that you're going to send something explicit.
Absolutely. So the 17-year-olds, I think, were like 23% or something compared to, I think it was like 6% of the 12, but it was perfectly linear in terms of the older, the more likely they were to do it, to send. And then receiving was about 20%, a little bit less. And so we asked whether it had been a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a romantic interest or some other person who wasn't a boyfriend or girlfriend. And so it's more likely that they're going to send and receive to and from somebody they're romantically involved with. And so that's 20% is not good, right? We don't want kids to be doing these kinds of things, but it's not 50%. It's not 75%. And I'm concerned because we've done some work on kind of social norming, and if we talk about this as normal behavior, not in the sense of it's okay, but as common, as frequent, like every kid is out getting drunk on the weekend, every kid's having sex, every kid's engaged, then if there's one thing that everybody can agree upon when it comes to adolescence is the one thing they want to do is fit in. They want to do what other people are doing. So if I hear these stories that everybody is engaging in sexting and I'm not doing it, then I'm going to feel some pressure to do it. And maybe my partner is pressuring me to send an explicit image, and I don't really want to do it, but I've seen all this stuff where everybody's doing it. So then I might acquiesce to that, even though the reality is most aren't doing it.
Your article highlighted that we need to teach our children safe sexting. Now, for the last decade or more, I've been saying to children, to adolescents and to parents, there's no such thing as safe sexting. So you're taking a harm minimization approach, and what I've been saying is you just can't do this safely. Now, once I read your article and the excitement of the headline went away, I actually think that there's an extraordinary amount of common ground here. We pretty much say the same thing, but we've framed it a little bit differently. So why would you say that we need to teach our children to sext safely or to send explicit content safely? Tell me a bit about that and how you would have that conversation with a child.
Yeah, so we used that title, provocative title, intentionally, and some of it is just riffing off safe sex education, because we talk about safe sex, and is sex ever 100% safe? And it's not. And it's the same thing with sexting. And so the reality is some young people are engaging in sexting. They are exchanging explicit images. And I got a lot of messages about that article. So it was in the Journal of Adolescent Health last year, and I got a lot of correspondence. Most of it very positive, kind of like what you said. Some of it was very negative, but it was clear from the criticism that they hadn't actually read the paper, right? So maybe they read the abstract, but they didn't actually read the argument. But the point is, if there is some segment of the population that's doing it, if they're going to do it, I would prefer that they do it in a way that will limit the most extreme, the most serious consequences that could happen. So if you think about sexting, the couple of things that you're most worried about as a parent, if your child would do it, is that the image they send will be shared with others, right? Will be kind of posted online for others to see. Two youth in a committed relationship exchange explicit images with each other and they don't go anywhere else. If it's just between those two and they never go anywhere else, we probably don't want them doing it, but there's no long-term serious consequences there. There is a good chance that, when you're talking about adolescents, that those images will potentially be shared, but kids need to know that. They need to be made aware that, look, if you share an image with somebody, they could share it with their friends, they could post it online, so they need to be aware of that. The other concern is the potential criminal implications. Is you don't want your child to be arrested for creating and distributing child pornography. So the kinds of strategies for safe sexting that we talk about, we may be taking the fun out of sexting. So you're doing it in a way where maybe you're not sharing something explicit, but you're sharing a flirty photo that has, the most explicit of explicit parts covered. You don't include your face, so that if it does get posted, it can't be linked directly to you, right? Don't include any identifying characteristics. Don't have it in your bedroom with, posters in the background, or, if you have that very obvious
family photo right there.
Don't have the picture of grandma on the back as you're doing this. That's not a good look. But we're not encouraging kids to engage in this behavior. We'd much prefer that they don't. But the kind of arguments I've had with people is they say, well, how would you feel if your child sexted? And I'd say I'd be mortified, I'd be disappointed. But if they did and they followed each of the strategies I offer in this article, it would minimize my concern, because it's less likely that the really worst of the bad implications will happen.
Okay, so how do you have the conversation with your child? Let's say you've got a 15-year-old who's entered a romantic relationship, and you just know that this is going to have to be a topic of discussion, because eventually somebody's going to put some pressure on someone somewhere to send an image. It is par for the course. When you look at the numbers in terms of how many children are being asked to send something like this to their romantic interest, those numbers are pretty high. Most girls will say that they've received substantial pressure from a number of places to send something explicit. So how do you have that conversation with your son or your daughter around the consensual aspect of it, and also just how do you even bring it up?
I think you do need to bring it up. I don't know that the data is that clear that it's happening as much as you say. I think the data are mixed. We've asked students in both of our 2016 and 2019 if they have been asked for explicit images and if they have asked others. And the numbers aren't above 40-50%. But I have seen some data. I was just talking with another researcher earlier this week, and her data was like 60 or 70%. She did more qualitative stuff. And I think the numbers are somewhere in between. I think it is happening. But nevertheless, as a parent, you need to have a conversation with your child, both boys and girls, about this. And it's all about kind of respect and consent and giving kids strategies for deflecting, making sure, number one, that they're not pressured to do anything they don't want to do, empowering them to make good decisions. And it's just like having to talk about sex, right? Parents have been struggling with this conversation for generations, and this is just another part of that conversation. And at some point, as a parent, you have to recognize the place that your child is in, and then maybe you have the conversation about sex and sexting and relationships and consent and what healthy relationships mean. And it's not common. Most kids aren't exchanging these images. Here are some considerations. Realize that this may be your boyfriend now, but not very many people end up marrying their high school, boyfriend or girlfriend. And so I actually had a student told me this. I was speaking at a school, and a student said, what I think about is, would I want my ex-boyfriend to have these images? And given that probably my current boyfriend is going to eventually be my ex-boyfriend, I don't know that I want to send him these images. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but definitely having these conversations. And honestly, I think as parents, you don't need to be an expert on this issue to dive into it with your kids. Take the time, do some reading, try to do some basic research, but struggle with these issues with your kids together. Maybe do some research together and learn about these things together. It's a difficult topic, but you can be in this with them together. It's that relationship that you have with your child is going to, more than anything, influence the decisions they make. They don't want to let you down. Their behavior is more a function of what you think and your relationship with them than they don't think they're going to get arrested for distributing child pornography. Plus, they're not going to. The odds are they're not going to. But are they going to upset you as the parent? Are they going to disappoint other relatives if they find out that they did that? So that relationship building is hugely important.
I love that. The other thing that strikes me quite strongly as you say this is that most of our children actually want to have this conversation with us. They're looking for us to show some. Yeah, they've got questions. They're looking for us to show some leadership. They're going to think that it's all icky and weird, and they don't know that they necessarily want to get into it. But once we start the conversation, most of them will actually be like, "Oh, I'm feeling relieved that I can talk to you about this." So we need to do that. You mentioned some deflection strategies. So let's say I've got a son or a daughter, and my child is being pressured by their romantic interest to send an explicit image, or they've been sent images that they didn't request, and as much as they really like their romantic interest, they would really kind of prefer that they not send that stuff to them. What are some useful deflection strategies that a parent could teach their child? How do you say no?
Yeah, I think there are actually quite a few websites that provide some kind of humorous responses, or you send pictures of fruit, or you do that kind of thing in response, just kind of make a lighthearted response. But I mean, there are some things you can do and say something to the effect of, "Look, my parents looked through my cell phone," or I don't feel comfortable with this," or "I've seen too many examples in the news where even though I love you, I just don't want to put either of us in a situation where something bad could happen in our relationship." So I think it's recognizing the nature of that relationship. But also, if you have a partner that is pressuring you to send images and you don't feel comfortable inside doing it, that's a problem that you're going to have to bring up in your relationship with that person. What's more likely is you really do love that other person, you have feelings for the other person, and you want to make them happy, and you don't want to let them down. And so having that conversation with them, if they're a good partner for you, they will understand that. And they'll as long as you explain what your heart is telling you, I think that it'll definitely be an opportunity for you to have this conversation without it getting too messy. And it's a difficult conversation, but you have to have these conversations in order to advance the nature of that relationship.
I say to my kids all the time, true friends don't ask you to do things that violate your principles. And if you're clear about your principles and you've got a boyfriend, because I've obviously got all these girls and they are mostly boy crazy, if you've got a romantic interest and he's pressuring you to do something that violates your deeply held principles, then he's not the right guy for you. And they respond really well to just an upfront conversation. I guess what you're really saying is it's about consent and respect, which is kind of where we started. Okay, let's switch the conversation to cyberbullying because we've got so much more to cover and time in these conversations always runs out so quickly. So how much is that happening and how do parents support their children? Because this is vexed, right? I mean, you've got a child who's getting bullied or feels like their relationships are falling apart, and try to gently support them and help them through these hard times is terribly hard, terribly challenging. So how much is it happening and what do we need to know?
Yeah, here in the US, our data show that about probably 25%, maybe a little bit more than that, of middle and high school age students have been cyberbullied at some point in their lifetime. 10 to 12% say they've experienced it in the most recent 30 days. Those numbers are pretty stable over the last 5 to 7 years.
And they're similar here in Australia too. Not a huge amount of difference there.
No, I mean, I think there's the public perception that cyberbullying is skyrocketing or that it's an epidemic. And it really has been pretty stable. Bullying at school has maybe decreased a little bit over the last 5 years here in the U.S., but it still happens more than the cyberbullying. In our research, we ask about cyberbullying in a pretty comprehensive way. We ask about, we define cyberbullying as intentional, repeated, and harmful things. And then we say, have you been cyberbullied? And then we ask about a dozen specific behaviors. Has somebody posted hurtful rumors about you online? Has somebody said something, like sexually explicit about you online? So we ask about it in a number of different ways. And the reality is, maybe a third of kids have experienced it. And it's probably likely that your kids will experience it at some point in their lifetime. And here again, I'm going to go back to the importance of the relationship, because kids are reluctant to tell parents about, all the negative experiences they have online, but especially, cyberbullying or sexting, because they're afraid that parents are going to freak out, that parents are going to take away the technology. And we know how important technology is in the lives of adolescents these days. So I think parents need to be proactive and talk with their kids and say, look, I know that you're going to run into some challenging situations online. I know you're going to have some problems with your friends and your partners. And just realize that I am here for you. We'll work through them together, whatever it is. I'm not going to throw your cell phone out the window. Certainly, if a child misbehaves online, if they're cyberbullying others or doing something they shouldn't be, maybe a break from technology is warranted, right, as a kind of a natural consequence. But far too often, kids who are being targeted are losing kind of their either social media privileges or online privileges under the guise that, look, if you're being bullied on Snapchat, if we kick you off Snapchat, you're not going to be bullied on Snapchat anymore. And basically now your child is being essentially victimized twice. And so help them work through that. So the other way to do it is have conversations with your kids in a way that empowers them. So give them tools. So let's talk about Snapchat, or let's talk about Instagram. How do you block somebody who's being mean to you? How do you report somebody? Because in all of these major apps, cyberbullying is a violation of their terms of service. So how do you report somebody? What should you do if you are being cyberbullied? You should maybe keep the evidence, take a screenshot, right? Don't say something mean back to the person. So give the child some very practical tools that they can use in the moment when it's happening, so that they're not panicking. And because the gut response of a kid who's being cyberbullied is to lash out and say something back mean to the other kid. And now it's not cyberbullying. Now it's a fight. Now it's conflict. And so that's different. So you don't want them to fall into that trap of getting involved in those behaviors.
I love the advice there, especially that last idea. Somebody may provoke you, somebody may niggle and tease and bully, but once you start to fight back, it becomes a conflict and it gets so messy. So if I was to summarize some useful strategies, what you're suggesting is you teach them how to block, you teach them how to report, you teach them how to actually come and get help. A lot of children don't want to come and get help because even if they're not going to lose their device, which is a far too common threat, most teenagers that I talk to will say, oh yeah, but when I involve the adults, that only makes it worse. You talked about empowering your children, and there's a strategy that I often share with parents where I talk about whether it's explicit content and sexting and all those sorts of things or cyberbullying. I like to start a conversation with my child nice and wide, whereby I say, so I want to have a chat with you about cyberbullying. I'm not going to ask so much about you. I'm just curious, do you see much of it happening while you're online? Are your friends involved in it? So you start wide. Do you see it happening much? Is it happening much at school? Do your friends get involved in it? How safe are your friends? How safe do you feel? And you get closer and closer to your child, but you've inched your way into the conversation with a very general commencement and just gotten closer and closer to them. And what my experience has been there with parents that I've shared it with and with my own children is that because we're not asking them anything directly about them initially, they feel completely safe and secure. This is a conversation about what's happening at school, not about what's happening to me. But bit by bit, we just come closer, and now they're in the conversation, and it's got some momentum, and they can feel what our motives are. They know that we're not on the attack. We're not coming at this strategically so that we can find out what's going on. I mean, we kind of are, but not in that way that makes them feel uncomfortable. And then they're much more likely to open up and say, actually, yeah, it has happened, or I'm watching it happen with my friend. And what I'm always conscious of is hopefully it's not happening to our children, But if it is happening to somebody they know, we get to talk to them about all of these hypotheticals. Well, what are some of the ways that you could help your friend? What are some of the things that your friend could do? What are some solutions that might be useful if it was to ever happen to you? And we're kind of pre-arming them before they're in it. Now, of course, if they're in it, we can go through the same process, but it's not quite as comfortable. And so I encourage parents to have these conversations ahead of time, especially if they know that something's happening in the friendship group or in that general social circle. It just seems to soften it a little bit.
I agree.
Justin, this has been such a really wonderful conversation. There's a couple of other things that I really briefly want to ask you before I get to my rapid fire 5 quick family questions. So just a couple of quick things. I know that you've watched those brilliant New Zealand NetSafe adverts talking about pornography, talking about grooming, talking about cyberbullying, talking about explicit material with your children. We've kind of covered a fair bit of that already, but I wonder if you could tell me, first of all, did you enjoy the content that they've shared as much as me? And secondly, can we just talk about developmentally when children are needing these conversations? Because obviously we're not going to talk to an 8-year-old about the same things that we will talk about with a 16-year-old. So when do we talk about cyberbullying and being safe online? What are the right ages to be having these discussions?
Yeah, first of all, I loved the videos because they have a little bit of a humor to them, and they approach really difficult subjects in a very approachable way. And it shows that you can have conversations with your kids about these things without making a huge deal out of it. And going back to what you said earlier about these conversations and being proactive, I think it's also important to pick the right time, right? So don't necessarily broach these topics right after your kids get out of school. They're worn down. It's been a rough day. And now you're going to be pelting them with all these questions. So wait till you're on that 45-minute drive to this fun thing that they're going to do, or this. Make sure they're in the right mindset to have these conversations. And when it comes to these kind of advertisements like this can help stimulate those conversations. You can watch them together, and it can be an opportunity for you to have this conversation. But when it comes to the age, that's a really tricky thing because every kid's a little different, right? And so I think as parents, we need to kind of sense like when our kids are on the cusp of participating in certain technologies. Like maybe your child is just now getting into a relationship with somebody, so then you need to sort of ease into those conversations. If you can see that they're maybe having some difficulty in interpersonal relationships at school, or if they're using technology more often, if they're just getting logged on to new apps, is a good opportunity to talk about safety on that particular app. So I think it really does differ depending on the child. And you have 6 daughters, I think, right? I mean, so I have to imagine each one was a little different in terms of when it was appropriate to broach certain subjects, and at what point you just pass it off to your oldest daughter to do the hard work. We
do a bit of it all. So sometimes we'll just have a general family conversation. We'll sit down and say, all right, guys, let's just talk about X, Y, or Z, and the whole family's in. And other times we sit down with the child because they've come and said, I'm on this app, or I want to download this app. So, I think that there's got to be that level of personalization. Let me spin the conversation around for just a sec. When you think about the work that you do, you'd be hearing stories all the time, and many of them would be scary and deeply concerning. Yet you're wonderfully optimistic. So I'm guessing that there have to have been some wonderful, uplifting, positive, powerful stories that you've seen in the cyber world in terms of people being resilient or making good out of the ugly that happens. I wonder if you can think of an example that might be hope-giving to parents who have heard this long conversation about all of these challenges and are wondering, how am I really going to survive this?
Yeah, I can appreciate that question. So Samir and I have written a number of books, and I don't know if it was 5 years ago or so, we came to the realization that we've written a lot of books for parents and educators, but we hadn't written anything for teens. So we set about to write a book for young people about cyberbullying. And so we started writing this book, and it was really depressing, right? Because it was talking about all these really bad things. So we'd have a chapter on what to do if you're targeted, what to do if you're thinking about cyberbullying others or you're engaging in these behaviors, what to do if you see cyberbullying. And it was all very helpful advice, but it was just kind of depressing. And then I had just seen a couple of examples where young people were using technology to promote positivity. And I thought, the cyberbullying is bullying amplified by technology. And I thought, why can't we amplify positivity, right? And I had seen these examples of kids in the US and abroad who are using technology to promote positivity and kindness and creating social media pages for the sole purpose of promoting kindness within their school or saying nice things about their classmates. And so that realization, we shifted that whole book where it is, the book is called basically Delete Cyberbullying and Make Kindness Go Viral. So it's half about cyberbullying, but then it's also how do we promote kindness and compassion and caring? And there's lots of examples of this. And so I think we can't lose sight of the fact that most kids are using technology safely and responsibly and appropriately. The more guidance we can give them, the better. The reality is most kids who do experience bullying and cyberbullying come out of it okay, and especially with some supports from adults in their lives. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic about, even though there are some very negative things online. But just the examples of teens themselves taking a leadership role in mentoring younger people, or creating some kindness campaign, or creating an app to help you wipe away some of these things. It's pretty inspiring.
What's your favorite one?
I have a soft spot in my heart. This is something that this is a Twitter feed that was created many years ago called Osseo Nice Things, and there's been many examples since then. But this young man named Kevin Kerwick, he was, I think, a junior or a senior, year 11 or year 12, and he just saw all the negativity online, so he created a Twitter feed where he just posts nice things about all of his classmates, and celebrities would retweet his stuff, and it was, it didn't have a ton of followers, but just a simple thing. Connor Suave, another kid, this is a valedictorian at his high school. For a whole year, he created an Instagram page where he anonymously posted pictures of his classmates. It was a pretty big school, and every day he would post a picture and then something nice about that person. And sometimes, this is a big school, sometimes he didn't know these kids very well, but he found something nice to say about them. He did this the whole year long, completely anonymously. He was valedictorian. He was given a speech at graduation, and he came clean about this project and said, look, I did this to try to make people feel good, at least on one day, but it really changed me in terms of how I look at people, and I look at people differently. And so those are just a couple examples off the top of my head that are very inspiring.
Yeah, I love that. It's given me the whole goosebumps and wet eyes kind of thing. That's beautiful. All right, last question before we do our famous five. How do you protect your son?
Well, I have conversations with him. He's my guinea pig, right? So he's 10 years old.
Poor kid.
And I probably 5 years ago, I remember having a conversation with him before bedtime, and I had to travel somewhere the next day to give a talk on cyberbullying. And so I was putting him to bed, and I said, I'm not going to be here in the morning because I'm going to be traveling to whatever city it was. And he said, well, what are you going to be doing? I'm going to give him a talk. And he said, about cyberbullying? And I said, yeah, that's right. I said, do you even know what cyberbullying is? And he said, yeah, it's bullying using a computer. And I said, that's pretty right, and as a 5-year-old or whatever he was back then. And I said, are you ever going to cyberbully anybody? And he says, no. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, because you're the guy that goes into schools and tells kids not to do it. So, for years I've been having conversations with him, and he's kind of, I think, a little behind the curve on his technology usage than a lot of his peers. So he doesn't have a cell phone yet. He'll be in year 5 next year. Some of his classmates do have their own smartphones. He's not on any social media app. He does have his mother's old iPhone from about 5 years ago that has Wi-Fi, but it doesn't have a cellular network. So he can use it in the house. And what he uses it for is he'll Google some insects and creatures and amphibians and stuff running around the yard. And he likes looking at the weather. So he likes to tell me what the weather is going to be like on any given day. But literally, just about every day, I'll have a conversation with him about his online use and if he runs into trouble. And he's very shy. And so even if he sees kissing on TV, he'll turn his eyes away. So I think I've got a little bit of time before I have to get into the relationship stuff. But it's a daily conversation for him.
And I love the fact that it's a daily conversation. This is not something that you have the talk and you put it away and say, all right, we've done that. This is an ongoing how we live our life. All right, Justin, let's dive into these 5 questions that I love to ask. Everyone gets the same ones, and they're meant to be pretty quick. We'll see how we go. Number one, if we asked your son his favorite thing to do with you, what would he say?
So I cheated and I saw your list and I quickly asked him before logging on with you. But he said exactly what I would have said. And this has changed. So this is something that stems from the sort of quarantine of the pandemic. So as you know, I'm a runner. And so I try to run every other day. I don't run every day, but I run every other day. And since mid-March, since he's been out of school, he has ridden his bike with me as I've been running. And so I'll run anywhere from 5 to 12 miles and he'll ride his little bike with me. And it's been incredible. We've been having long conversations. Most of the time we're just doing storytelling. So we'll make up some fictional story. Right now, the current story is we're on a different planet and we have to survive and there's creatures. So that would be the one thing that he loves doing with me, apart from just adventures out in the wilderness. But it's been a blast over the last couple of months, just spending more time with him.
What's been your trickiest parenting moment?
I think the hardest thing to deal with our son is he's harder on himself than we are on him. So if he makes a mistake or if he does something he knows is wrong, he's really hard on himself and he'll be upset. He'll lock himself in his bedroom, not literally, but he'll just want to be away. And we're like, look, it was a mistake. It was fine. And when we gave him a knife for his Boy Scouts, like the first time he's using his knife, he cut himself, right? There's blood everywhere and he's crying, I'll never use a knife again. And just way over that. It's like, look, mistakes happen. So I think the hardest thing for me is balancing him being harder on himself than us being on him. And that's really hard to figure out.
Yeah, great. If you could spend an hour with your son at any age at all, what age would you pick and why?
Well, this is probably a cop-out, but I would pick right now. I honestly would. And part of it is he's 10. I mean, maybe when he's 16 or 18, it'll be different. But he's really fun to be around right now. He's starting to think more deeply. He's very inquisitive. He loves creatures, animals, and I don't want to go back to the diaper days and the early days of no sleep when he was a baby. But these are really good days. I would take an hour with him right now, all day long.
No matter how good life has been, Justin, and how glad you are to be in the moment right now, what are you most looking forward to as a dad?
I'm looking forward to seeing my son evolve and doing more fun things with him as he becomes more independent. I'm nervous about the future, of course, but I think that every year has been better than the last. And so I'm really excited for seeing his independence and his growth and his learning and seeing him interact with others. And so maybe moving beyond sort of us as parents and finding his peer group and doing fun things with them.
If you could go back to Justin Patchin as a young dad, having one of those tough moments with literally no experience at this parenting thing at all, what advice would you give yourself?
I think I would tell myself that not to get too worked up about it. And it's when I look back on the kind of challenges I've faced, I've been really lucky and blessed and fortunate because I haven't been to the emergency room with my son yet. There hasn't been any really serious problems. There's been challenges, of course, but I think I would tell myself, chill out. It's no big deal. You're going to get through this. And I hope I can tell myself that in a couple of years in the future when other things happen.
Well, Justin, I've just thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I wish we could keep on talking. If people want to find out more about you and the work that you do and how to keep their children safe online, what's the best thing that they can do?
Well, our website is cyberbullying.org, and that's where we've got all the stuff about cyberbullying, sexting, social media. You can look more about me kind of professionally and personally at justinpatchin.com. But cyberbullying.org is definitely where it's at. We have a blog where we comment on things usually about every other week or so. So a lot of free information for you to figure out how to navigate all these online challenges.
Justin Patchin, it has just been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights and wisdom and experiences with us.
I appreciate the opportunity. This was a great conversation.
We've discussed some really confronting but important topics on the podcast today, and I hope that you'll be able to take some of Dr. Justin Patchin's insight and put it into practice with your own children. And you can also find all of Dr. Justin Patchin's books available at cyberbullying.org. Well, thank you again for being part of the Parenting in Perspective podcast. I'd love for you to join me, Dr. Justin Coulson, next time as I talk with the award-winning children's author, Mem Fox, about her experiences growing up, her parenting journey, and of course, her work writing some of our children's favourite books.
The books come from my heart. They don't really come from my brain. Now, if they were coming from my brain, I would probably say, yes, I want to get this lesson out. But it's because of my love of humanity, I just want warmth in the world. I just want kindness.
That's author Mem Fox. She's my next guest on the Parenting in Perspective podcast. If you've enjoyed the podcast, could I ask one thing before we run? Could you jump into Apple Podcasts and leave a rating and a review of the podcast? This is how people get to find the podcast. They get to hear all these great conversations and change their lives, change their families. I got a review that came through just in the last week or two from Size account. The title of the review is Life Changing. It's a 5-star review. Thank you so much for that. Here's what it says. Since Dr. Justin Coulson has entered our parenting life, things have changed for the positive in a big way. The podcasts may be short, sweet, and at times hilarious, but wow, they are powerful and have had a huge impact on how my husband and I parent our 4 children. Thank you, Dr. Coulson. Your advice has made such a positive difference to our family life. From Marylise, and that's a 5-star review. It's those 5-star reviews. I don't need to know about the 1 or 2-star reviews. Please don't leave them. If you're not happy with the podcast, just don't listen to it anymore. But if you're enjoying the podcast, please leave those 5-star reviews and help us to get the word out. Maybe share the podcast with your friends in your parenting groups, around your school community, whatever it might be. So very grateful for that. Additionally, if you'd like more information about how you can get up close and personal with me and how I can really be that parenting expert in your pocket, we have Happy Families memberships available on a month-to-month basis for as little as $12 per month, or if you pay up front for a year, as little as $10 a month. It's so valuable and so cheap. If you would like more information, visit happyfamilies.com.au. Okay, well, that is really everything for the podcast now. Thank you so much for listening to the Parenting in Perspective podcast, a Happy Families podcast from happyfamilies.com.au, and a very quick thanks to Justin Roulon for making the podcast sound great.